Welcome back to War Thunder. Welcome to the tank review on the E-100. And I have to, introduce you with a few words about what I want to show in this tank review. First of all, it will be split into most likely three parts. The first one will be about the armor and the interior and the differences to the mouse, which are not unimportant. And you might think, well, it's basically the same tank. No, it's not. I also will then in the second review part tell you everything about the comparison to its major opponents on the battlefield, stat comparison, and then actually for the first time gameplay in the E-100 review. And in the third part I want to tell you a lot about the tactical impact that this tank as well as the mouse can have, and I will point out the differences, the similarities, how you can use your tank in the new matchmaker meta, with 7.7 being very often top tier, and give you tips and tricks how to deal with this tank, but also how to fight against it. And I think you will be then much aware of that this tank compared to the mouse is balanced and both have significant weaknesses and strength, but it depends entirely on the situation. So yeah, there will be no gameplay, it will be very boring, but I decided to make it because I need to talk about the armor quite excessively, and not everybody can just flash up War Thunder and look at the tank and look at the armor or the interior, therefore, if you want to know how to take it out. So this is a part of mine, or this is why I made the decision to make a single part about the armor, because it will take quite some time. So first of all, the lower plate, 120 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 49 degrees slope backwards. So effective thickness somewhere between 190 and 230 millimeters, depending on the exact angle that you look at it. So most of the time it's angled either way, and you have around about 280 330 millimeters of effective thickness. Not a lot of people shoot at this part, but if you make a real stand at a certain position, always angle the tank. And next to the mouse, I think there are not many tanks except some Russian heavy tanks like the IS-4, IS-3 that can compete with that in this respect. So yeah, and even if they penetrate here, they do not do a lot of damage, because behind that is, much like on a Tiger II, a transmission, and that eats up a lot of damage. So just very high penetrating heat shells or APDS, APFSDS in particular will go through and deal damage. But if you angle it, the damage is always in the line of sight, so they will not deal too much damage. And then we come to the front plate. 200 millimeters at 61 degrees of angles. This is just absurd. We have, without any angling, at the weakest 340 millimeters at this part here, and it's without any weak spot going up to 350. If you shoot a bit from below, 370, 360, and if you angle it, well, forget it. Even ATGMs say goodbye, and even if you penetrate at this angle, well, you do not do a lot of damage to the interior. So you can see this tank is something that you really have to look for where to shoot at. And the upper part is sloped backwards at 72 degrees. So the effective thickness is too much even for the armor indicator here. So you are on this bar here that is sloped backwards, a ridiculously tough target. I think I never got penetrated here, maybe even in arcade when I face an Raketenjagdpanzer 2 Hot. But in any case, this is just a tough nut to crack. This part here seems like a weakness with 120 millimeter, but in fact it's not, because this part is not protecting the inside. This is just an extension to hold the side skirts. So the side armor, let's move on, is 120 millimeters. on both this part and the part behind here, so just under the turret. That's a tough nut to crack, and I have not really a possibility to look at the part that is the connection between them, but basically you cannot really splash up. It's either, I think it's 60 millimeters if I'm not mistaken, but at least it's 40 millimeters. And here we have thick tracks with 60 millimeters, which are also wide, so they give relatively good ground pressure, which is kind of surprising. And we also have interlocking road wheels, so that you have a relatively smooth suspension despite your 150 tons of weight. And they give additional armor protection of around about 20 millimeters because this is structural steel of chassis. And yeah, from this part it's flat, much like on an IS-4 or IS-4 behind the tracks. And there we have the side skirts. It's rolled homogeneous armor. We have 3 parts, and they can actually get ripped off by extremely heavy hits. So this has changed with the last update because of the recent tournament. And so Gaijin had a look at the E-100 and they thought, well, those things have to come off. So if those bolts cannot withstand the kinetic force of an impact, or for example a hash shell, a big one, then those parts come off and you have just flat 120 millimeters behind that, and that makes you then so much more vulnerable. So this is a disadvantage compared to the mouse, which always keeps it 180 millimeters, but this is flat. So we have around about 77, let's say 80 millimeters of effective thickness and 120 there. So by default 200 millimeters here, and it goes thicker and thicker and thicker, and now it begins the magic. We have now here a 109 millimeters, and then here you have no space between the side skirts and the actual side armor, but you have up to 160 millimeters. So that gives you by default 280 up to 300 millimeters of side armor, which is just absolutely absurd. There are not many tanks that can penetrate that. And because the distance is so big that even if you get penetrated like let's say here with a T10M stock shell, and he tries to penetrate also the side armor, he might be able to do so depending on the exact angle, but the fuse gets triggered here and it prematurely detonates sometimes. So it's not that often that you get penetrated there, except again if the side skirts come off. And even ATGMs, when they hit you there, or big heat shells, then the distance, the travel distance of the heat beam up until the point it hits the second armor plate is just so often so great that you take no damage at all. And of course hash shells get completely neglected, and you have different segments again. So this is really tough. The hull is amazing, but we are not done yet. There is the rear armor. Again, 150 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. So you have the pure thickness, and that gives you around about 180 millimeters at flat ground of effective thickness because of the 30 degrees of angle. So without any angling, 180 millimeters. If you add to that things like the tracks here or the exhaust things like that, the exhaust pipes and their cover, you can absorb sometimes very strange shots. And if you angle it, like somebody pops up behind you, you angle the turret, you angle the hull, and as long as they don't have APDS or heat, they also will struggle to go through. This is the pure line of sight thickness, or the raw thickness of the frontal plate of the Tiger II, which is infamous even at 6.7. So you kind of see this tank has a lot of big, raw, thick armor. Then there is the engine deck with 40 millimeters. We have additional 10 millimeters and 20 millimeter parts here, which is nice. And you can see here we also have internal armor, and the bottom of the tank is also 40 millimeters. I'm not quite sure if you can see it right here, but if it glances through, yeah, you can see it. So that is weaker than on the mouse, for example. and that makes you vulnerable to even 50-kilogram bombs, which is highly frustrating if they land a bit further away or their splash does not hit the bottom of the tank. Then you can absorb again ridiculous amounts. But it's really the 40 millimeters here on the front that makes this tank very tricky or very vulnerable rather, to shot traps. A weakness that the mouse does not really have, or it's not that prominent because of those protection for the front mounted engine. Also, we can see we also have internal armor on the mouse, but on the E-100 it's twice as thick. So back to the E-100. Yeah, then we have the turret, and the turret looks much like a copy and paste version of the mouse. It is and it isn't. So the shape is much the same, and we also have the 220 millimeter cast homogeneous armor of 220 millimeters of thickness. It's curved, as you can see here, like it's a half circle shape, but it's big. It's a big target here and even a bigger target here, so the gun is a bit off from the center. I mean, not the main gun, but the whole gun mantle. So because it's cast homogeneous armor, you get an armor value reduction factor of somewhere between 0.95 and 0.9. I think it's 0.9 more or less, because I can penetrate this part here even with the APHE shell from the American long-barreled 90mm, which has 204 millimeters of penetration. And so this is the weak spot of all weak spots. If you want to shoot somebody like an IS-6 at close range, he just points at this area and dubs you his BR-471B shell in the face with 207 millimeters of penetration, will penetrate and deal massive damage. So there is that. And then we have here a lot of chance for the shell to ricochet downwards and then go through this part here. It's very damaging, even if it's an AP shell, but it's all the more destructive if it's an APHE shell. Even the ones from the Object 906 will go in and one-shot you outright. With APDS rounds, on the rare occasions where the misfire and hit there, you can survive it, but yeah. Then we can see here is a big hole, both for the machine gun. It's a small hole, but you know, it's not really a weak spot. Here where the gun is, but we have a big overlay with this 240mm cast homogeneous armor. And this is where now a big difference to the mouse comes in. Do you see this actual gun mantle here? It still has 240mm cast homogeneous armor. Nobody would really shoot here. But when a mouse angles its turret, we have 100mm of cast homogeneous armor. And this is where knowledge comes in. You can penetrate this with almost every tank, and you think to myself, yeah, I can penetrate, but I will not do the damage, okay? That's wrong. If you shoot there with an APHE shell, it will damage the gun breach on the inside, and it also will kill maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 crew members in the turret. So while the mouse is not vulnerable that much to getting shot trapped, when it's angling to trying to defend the front plate here, or the front part of the turret, you can still penetrate it here. And even if you are side on, you can try to shot trap it here. Back to the E-100. The rest of the turret is much the same, to be honest. So let's talk about the side. And this is where, again, knowledge comes in. It's rolled homogeneous armor, so you get the full value out of it. And we have, again, a slope of 30 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 235 millimeters. And if you are close by and you shoot a little bit up, nearly 250 millimeters. So that is very strong. However, this part here is not a weak spot. It's 220mm thick, but cast homogeneous armor, but then again sloped, so it's not really a weak spot. It's practically the same thickness as the side of the turret. But this part here, that one is actually flat. So still 200mm, but no angling going on. If now you angle the turret, much like this, You can see we have 300 to even 400 millimeters of thickness, 300 here as well. So that means if you perfectly angle, you are practically completely safe to be penetrated from the American based 90 millimeter heat FS shell, the good one with 320 millimeters. And very often people do not really aim when they have heat. They just slung it into the general direction of your tank, expecting to penetrate it. And even if they penetrate here, they will not deal a lot of damage, but more on this in a moment. And the rear of the turret is also a little bit angled and 200 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor thickness. That gives it an effective thickness of 207 millimeter, meaning that the rear of the turret is stronger than the front when it's flat on the flat parts. Just think about this. So you will not get penetrated from the rear from an IS-6, for example, or a lot of the Russian tanks with the BR-400 and 71B shell. The D shell, the post-war shell, has a good chance of going through. So yeah, you can see here that you have a big weak spot here where people can penetrate. And you know, it's an obvious weak spot. It's difficult to hide. You can angle what you want, but it's a big horizontal and vertical weak spot. That's what I want to say. But if somebody just fires in the general direction, yeah, it will not go through. About the gun mantle, again, it's 240 millimeters thick, but here are flat parts, and there is no overlap with the actual turret armor, so you can penetrate, for example, here on those flat parts if you have the necessary penetration with APDS or whatnot. And yeah, the rest is rounded and very difficult to penetrate. But here, this part, I will just go out of the armor review. It's like shaped like from here on, you aim directly on the gun and it will for sure go down. This part is like straight flat. Yeah, it's straight flat angled, if that makes sense. So you can look at this part here also on the mouse in better light maybe, and you can see that this is just a big shot trap. So the armor on the E-100 is different to the mouse, but in its general, philosophy, build-up, it's much the same. But the mouse trades the more or less security for a not having that much of a shot trap compared to the 100, which is much safer from Russian 122mm or Russian 100mm APHE shells here on the gun mantle, but therefore gets a shot trap that is much more prominent. So there is that. So you have to really keep that in mind. Yeah, so you get the hang of it. One final part is here that we have 60mm of roof armor, and there we have just two holes, and those are those two mini cupolas, but you cannot really hit them because the tank is so small. Like the T95 just goes up like here. Good luck trying to hit them if you are in brawling situations. And if somebody is above you, he has much more juicier targets than this one, so keep that in mind. Now let's talk about the interior. As I have mentioned, we have the transmission in the front and the engine in the back, and we have the machine gunner here on the left side, which is funny because that's the actual machine gun. Then here we have the driver in typical German fashion. We have the driving shaft or the transmission going through the entirety of the tank, which also gets easily damaged even by shrapnels, so you are immobilized very often. And yeah, we have the fuel tanks here on the bottom, but they do not get ignited that often, and they certainly do not explode, much like on the old damage model on the Tiger II. Then we have here the engine, and this is a very compact engine with 900 horsepower, which is funnily enough much the same as on the 10.5 centimeter Tiger II, although it looks slightly different due to different radiators or carburetors on top of it, whatever, but it's much like the same engine also like on the Panther II. Funnily enough about this engine, so that I will not forget it, we have internal armor. And as we can see here, it's protected from the rear and from the front, but also from the side. And that is very important because you cannot ignite this engine with hash from the rears, for example with the FV4005 or the 120mm British hash, which would still get the 152mm of penetration. So it will penetrate, but it has no use. Just solid shots or APDS will deal damage, or HeatFS. So there is that. I think this is a very good guide on the armor of the E-100. There is also this turret ring, but it's thick, 152mm, and it's a very small target. So let's talk about furthermore the X-ray. We have a loader and a second one here. They are diagonal across, so this one is most likely responsible for the big 128mm, and this one is responsible for the 75. But even with one loader, you're fully combat capable. So even if you're down to 2 crewmen, you have the base reload. But recently, it feels like you have a much longer reload on the 128 and on the 75. You also have your gunner here and the commander. So APAG penetration in the turret will most likely kill all 4 crew members. Unlike on Russian medium tanks such as the T-54 series, the gun breach will not very often protect crew members. So APAG penetrates, 4 crew are dead, most likely. Funny thing about this cannon breach is this here is just highlighted, okay? And also the part between the, well, basically this part here, but the second you want to have a look at it, it doesn't get highlighted, so it's not directly a part of the gun breach. But still, if you damage it, the tank is out of action, at least for the main gun. And this is where angling comes into handy, because you always want to angle like this, so you might expose your gunner, but that's not the issue. The issue is if the enemy wants to kill your cannon breach of the 75 or the gun barrel. So with the 128, you actually protect the 75, which is in most situations more valuable than the 128, because you cannot protect the 128 in any way, shape or form. And I will really make a huge discussion out of the 75, because this is what sets this tank apart from like 99% of all other tanks in War Thunder, together with the mouse. And talking about the ammunition, we have a lot of ammunition for the 75, and you should take the maximum amount for it with it, except the stuff in the turret. So overall, just 43 shells is the maximum amount that you should take with you. No, yeah, 43. So you have to throw out like 24 shells out of the tank for the 75. And then this part here is empty, so even if somebody aims here and expects you to have loaded this ammunition so he can easily ammo rack you, you get disappointed. He gets disappointed and you just lose the loader and the commander, which is painful but ultimately will not kill you. Same goes for the ammunition of the 128, and this is where again a difference to the mouse comes in because of how the ammunition is stored. Overall, the maximum amount of main caliber ammunition that you should take with you is 19, because we have here 18 propellant charges but more warheads in the hull. And so one is already registered as in the breach, so 19. If you take like 21 with you, you can see that those propellant charges appear. And suddenly somebody can ammo rack you from the front by shooting here, killing the gunner, the loader, and ultimately blowing up the tank, which is something that you don't want. If you remove the turret ammunition, there is a lot of space that is just empty, reduces the damage of incoming shells, and you can survive for so much longer. Because ultimately the E-100, while good at killing tanks from the side and also a lot of non-Russian tanks from the front, I will talk about this later on, the tank really relies on surviving, and removing a lot of ammunition and giving the crew maximum survivability skills and also giving it an ace crew makes a big difference. So with that in mind, yeah, that's the E-100 armor and interior for you. It's a fantastic tank and it's comparable to the mouse, but it's not a one-to-one copy. Please keep that in mind. And furthermore, well, let's talk about the upgrades. They are exactly the same as on the mouse. First of all, for the 128mm, the Panzergranate 43 is not as urgent as the Hochladungsgranate 38C. Why? Because it has 100mm of penetration compared to the stock 80mm. And then ultimately get also this KGR Rot Nebel, because this smoke shell is what makes the 100 and the mouse really strong. Of course, the usual upgrades, parts, fire extinguishing, crew replenishment, also very viable. If you just lock down a cap circle and you are just a big middle finger to a lot of enemy tanks that want to challenge you. Also the precision of the gun, and also the tracks are very important for the better maneuverability, as well as the suspension and the engine, transmission, filters and brake system ultimately. So the E-100 has a stock grind, but it's not as, let's say, ridiculous as, for example, on a Leopard 1. So you have here the benefit of armor. And with that, that's the first part of this tank review. I'm sorry that it was so boring. I'm sorry that I went into so much detail, but I had to mention it to make it a complete and first part of a tank review, and not just a saying, yeah, it has a lot of armor here and there, don't shoot this and just angle and so on. How exactly you angle the tank and how you can work around the shot trap will be part of another part of the tank review, where I really talk about how to play the tank. So angling gives you a first hint about the strength, much like this. You also can angle the tank, the hull like this, and then angle the turret like this, so that you can show like the side of your turret to the enemy that you charge if it doesn't have HeatFS or APDS, so that you completely neglect the shot trap and just drive them nuts and they think you present them an easy target and they don't think about trying to take out your gun. But sometimes they do, but then again it depends which kind of enemy play you face. So again, this is the first part, and I finally have to stop here to make it somewhat short, he said. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Please appreciate this tank review, the first part at least, with giving it a like. Let me know in the comment section what you think about this kind of tank review, about a rare tank that you cannot see in your own hangar in the full screen basically, so you can have a detailed look at it yourself. And yeah, please give this video a like if you did, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see each other on the battlefields of War Thunder.